So I don't know how much time I have, but let me just say that the last hour and a half has been like being in a marketplace of frustrations, dilemmas, expectations, and a lot of case studies of things which have worked. But there was a loud call from all of you that we need some type of action. Some type of action. We're still not clear about what that is. But before I come down to 3 points that I want to make, let me reach out to my colleague from Brazil. You prompted me to recollect a study done by the World Bank a few years back on social inclusion. And I think it put it in very nice terms that what the world needs to know is to ask and understand better who's excluded, why is that exclusion, how and why. There is no global mapping, and there is no national level mapping at all of those who are socially excluded. So there is something that has been on the table, but there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of word speaking, but frankly you don't see much that has gone down at the level of action. And there is a belief that it's not that last 70 years of development has not had an impact. In many countries, there is what one could call first generation communities that have developed from knowledge, from learning, from money. And probably these are the ones who should be brought into the front line in locations like yours so that they could then become the agents of change rather than think that everything will have to be done out of Washington with money and knowledge. Imagine combining this first generation communities with Nandan's thing on digital and technology. That might be a more lethal way to bring about the change and transformation that you're talking about. A second quick one which didn't come up at all was the climate and debt interaction, and I do want to put a way to sort of for all of us to think, because there's been a lot of discussion on money and funding, that I've always looked at debt and climate dynamic as a stock and a flow problem. The debt is the stock. The climate change that is coming in is more the flow. And quite frankly, I don't see how any policymaker or any technology can ever overlay a brand new plumbing network on top of sewage and filth and the stock of garbage that has accumulated over time, which is debt. So there will be an issue of sequencing which no one is taking on right now, that should space be provided on the debt stock, clean it up, and then get on to all the reforms that we are complaining about, the frustrations. And I think that issue, Scott, I know you will agree that this is not something that has got mainstream yet in the whole discussion about just give money to MDBs for climate. But the problem is, I just don't see, at least in 50 countries, about 1.3 billion people on this planet Earth, where you can think of putting any additional dollar without trying to do the cleanup of debt. So I just wanted to put those two things. And very quickly, mindful of the time, if policymakers were to construct an anxiety index today, think of one, there doesn't exist any. I just cooked up one this morning. What elements will it have? Immigration, inequality, globalization, technological disruption, unclear growth trajectory, and accelerating climate change. These will be all that will be in that index. And these are not new problems. I mean, they have been always there. But I think what has happened since 2008 global crises, and I think that is in many ways a benchmark, shock after shock after shock after shock, 4 rounds of shocks, have just amplified these sources of anxiety to a point where we are all feeling collectively overwhelmed. And there was a recent analysis actually just published early this week, done by some of my former friends at the IMF, which shows that over 30 years, and this is really very granular data across 130 countries collected over 3 decades, that macroeconomic shocks have created more violence in these countries where there has been higher inequality. So there is a very interesting analysis now that is coming up on how do you explain conflict and social tension as a result of these shocks after shocks after shocks. And the manifestation of that is coming up in the ugliness of violence, social unrest. And I think that worries a lot, because I think the message which the IMF will never say, I can say it now, That I think one big risk is that if this all doesn't come together, whether it's Washington or at local levels, then this planet will not probably have a big cataclysmic climate event, but there could be a very, very massive social uprising or unrest that could come about, and that's not a non-trivial risk. There are, as I said, a billion and 1.3, 1.4 billion people who are at absolute deprivation over a long period of time on repression, on famines, on food, and they are unable to even see where it's all going to end. And somebody has to think about them before we start talking about some grand ideas. I'm not in the camp, personally, that the MDB reform is going to be the solution. I'm sorry to say this. Sorry, Scott. But I belong to one of them, I belong in that community, and I think it's just a nice way to take the big problem out and create some distraction of giving the MDB reform. I mean, MDB reform, the World Bank reform, the Development Bank reform has happened about 3 or 4 times in the 30 years that I have been working. I've seen that play, and it frankly doesn't quite happen. And nor is it the case of putting money. As I said, there's a stock and a flow problem between debt and climate. I think where in ORF our thinking is developing is that probably we have to find ways of taking the current infrastructure, the current global arrangements, and try and see how can we make them more action-oriented and more responsive to the big questions of the day. And here, some kind of collective action along with technology. And this Nandan knows better, I'm just coming as a non-technology person, but some combination of that could probably start catalyzing change that is eluding all of us. I don't think that there's paucity of ideas. I don't think there's a paucity of the net resource that we have. There is not enough resource, there never will be. But to say that there is no cash or there's no money is probably a misleading narrative. And nor is it proper to say that the whole world is corrupt. There are lots of extremely talented people in these countries that I'm talking about, the 40, 50 countries who are at the margin. The question is, how do we harness all of them? So proper management, strengthening institutional capacity, what I think Scott mentioned about knowledge dissemination, sensible uses of automation, and putting more well-targeted dollars on the ground to work. That type of an approach, which everybody has talked about, but somehow you have never seen that come together in any actionable form, may be the way to go, rather than distract ourselves one more time with this massive MDB reform. The US nominee who might become the president of World Bank, it's not official yet, right, has gone out at a forum at CDG when he was saying that, listen, I do not have a magic wand, and nor is he saying that the solution to all the problems is going to be more financing. I think there is a limit on the financing agenda because there is no free money. That money will come at a cost. Somebody mentioned about perhaps a cost that will be borne eventually by the borrowers. I worry more that the debt accumulation will only keep on growing because that money just cannot be produced. It has to be coming from somewhere. Central banks will print money, or there'll be more tax, or there'll be some more nefarious ways in which resources will come about. So let's sort of be in this. My closing point here is that there is an issue that often again doesn't come up about global governance arrangements in order to oversee this transformation that we all are talking about. If one reviews the history of global economic arrangements, the whole history is about 70 years since international development really came about. This is what economic historians have come up with. 70 years is the history. And in that, the number of Gs, the groupings, the number of committees, and the number of subcommittees, the whole architecture at the global level that exists is huge, overlapping, intertwined, and highly inefficient. I don't think that we want to layer that up by creating anything new. Again, in my view, that will just take the thing away from the core purpose. Perhaps all this can be used the way it is. And, yes, agreeably, these challenges are different than the ones that were there in the 1940s or even earlier. But if only this arrangement could minimize the disagreements, the conflict, the suspicions, and the skepticism then I think we will be able to move much faster on this track. So let me end here with a final pitch, which did come up from the panel in the right one, that we want to hear more of the borrowers' voices and the countries who are at the margin. They have been the recipient of this 70-year development agenda that I mentioned, but I don't hear much about what their own experience has been as borrowers on what has worked and what has not worked. So I hope that that gets much more voice as people come up with some fancy ideas, and people like yourselves will ultimately take that decision. So thank you very much, and I think this was stimulating, and I'm sure that many of the ideas of this today will resonate over the week in Washington.
Thank you. Well, have a great spring break meeting week. Thank you.